He's a retired minister. He told me all along, give me a long name. And I said, please, Mark, if you want to say something, go ahead yourself. Maybe I asked Mark to do that. Mark, go ahead.
How much time you got? Mark Cry is my name. No, I'm not related to the person that does well drilling around here. But we've moved here after I had spent time at Bethany Reformed Church, which is just down Burdick Street. We were in New Jersey. I was at a church there for 13 years. And then I finished my ministry work as a faculty member of New Brunswick Theological Seminary. And one of the pieces of information that showed up on our table was that Rutgers University and Princeton University played the first football game. It was just down the hill from our seminary. And a bunch of our seminary students were playing there.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
And over here, I don't think I see any guests. Guests not here. Move over here by David. Do we have guests? No guests here. And Donnie.
I have a guest tonight. It's my brother, Nick, who is a mechanical engineer, son of Walter Turner, father of Jackie. Thanks for coming, Nick.
All right. We'll move on to our program, but I've asked someone to introduce the speaker this evening, who will try to lend a little credibility to what the speaker is about to share with you.
Well, thank you, scintillating speaker. Tom Dietz received his BA and MA degrees in American history from Wayne State University, where he completed his doctoral studies, although he did not finish his dissertation. I'll have to say that the field of history, an active public history field, drew him away from that. I'm ad-libbing that. His major areas of study were American foreign policy, American labor history, and history of the Soviet Union. He took a position as curator of urban history at the Detroit Historical Museum in 1984, where he was employed until 1992. And that year he moved to Kalamazoo and became the curator of local history at the Kalamazoo Public Museum. When it was under construction, he actually did time in the old building, the library building, and worked at the new building, and he worked there until his retirement in 2014. While he was at KVCC, because the museum is under KVCC, he was active in the Faculty Association. He served 2 terms as president. He also served 2 terms as president of the Michigan Conference of the American Association of University Professors. Since his retirement, he's been active with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Western Michigan University. He serves on the curriculum committee. He's the co-chair. He teaches courses on Kalamazoo history and American labor history. And if any of you are interested in teaching a course, he'd love to talk to you. His program tonight reflects his interest in labor history and radical political activism. Although the industrial workers of the world were only active for less than 2 decades, their nickname Wobblies has given them a certain fame. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Tom Dietz.
All right, this is working. Good, I can hear it, so it must be. I knew I needed a good introduction for this, but it's true. I have loved labor history. I've done labor history. I am looking for my notes here, which must be in the other. There we go. All right. The Wobblies are interesting. Everybody's heard about them. What? Know very little about them. I should point out, Sharon mentioned that this is when the Wobblies were active. Actually, the Wobblies are still active, but they're in a different sort of incarnation now, as it were, than this group. Too loud? Too loud? Can I do something about that?
Can you just move the speaker?
What do I do?
No, we're moving the speaker.
Oh. Is everything fine? Okay. All right. So anyway, I'm not here to, kind of try to get you to join the Wobblies, because you can do that. Go to their website. Right now they have a website, and they are still using the same constitution that they developed back in 1905. But I think they're more of an aspirational unit. So anyway, I'll start with this interesting photo. Those of you who were up there at Max Yasgur's farm in August of 1969 for 3 days of just music and love will remember when Joni Baez sang the beautiful Ballad of Joe Hill. You may have wondered, actually, was there a person, Joe Hill, and why did they write a ballad about this person? Well, there really was a Joe Hill. He lived from 1879 to 1915. He was actually born in Sweden. He was his real name is Joel Haglund. He changed it to Joe Hill when he came to the United States. Like many of the workers who were coming to the United States at the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, he was an unskilled worker, and he traveled around, particularly in his case, he went to the West, and he did various jobs. He worked in the mines, he worked in the lumber industry. There was a shipping trade that moved between, say, California ports up to Northwest Washington. It was just a series of odd jobs. But he was a union activist. He was a member of the industrial workers of the world. The ballad was written about him because it tells about how he was killed. He was murdered, according to the song. He was executed for a murder. Maybe he committed it. Maybe he was framed. It's hard to say. A grocer was murdered in Salt Lake City. There were no witnesses. They do know there was an exchange of gunfire. And Joe Hill went to the doctor, and he had a wound. But he refused to say how he got wounded. They said, well, they never found the murder weapon. They did say the person had a red bandana, and sure enough, Joe had a red bandana. The trial went along. He was tried. He was found guilty, and he was executed. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Says Joe, what they could never kill, went on to organize. Anyway, he was a member, as I say, of the Wobblies. And one of his skills, he was an active member, is he wrote song lyrics for the Wobblies. He drew cartoons for their publications. The songs were very useful in communicating the labor message with these unskilled workers, many of whom were recent immigrants, may have not been literate, at least literate in English, and so songs could help spread the story that the Wobblies were selling. They actually had the Little Red Songbook that they published, that they shared around. It was edited by a man by the name of Ralph Chaplin. Those of you who have ever been to a labor rally, a labor march, or anything like that, may remember the labor song that frequently gets sung, Solidarity Forever. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, Ralph Chaplin, a Wobbly, wrote that song. And he edited this. Anyway, the industrial workers of the world were organized in Chicago in 1905 at a convention that had been pulled together by a variety of labor activists, union members, political radicals, social reformers, saying the unions that we have now are just not adequate. We need to come up with a union that really addresses the needs of the workers. So, Big Bill Haywood, so I've talked ahead of my slide. Big Bill Haywood was a member of the Western Federation of Miners, and he was the active member of that organization on the executive board. So he gets these people together in Chicago. Specifically, they want to get rid of the old-style traditional craft unionism of the American Federation of Labor, which, for reasons we'll see later, they felt just simply was inadequate to all these workers. And keep in mind, this is the booming economy, so there are many, many of these industrial workers out there. So they want to get rid of that. And their aim is, of the union is to, this organization shall be to put the working class in possession of the machinery of production without regard to the capitalist masters. Okay, so they're a radical organization. Here's Big Bill Haywood. He was born in 1869. He had a variety of jobs as he grew up. He started out in agriculture as a farmer, and if you're thinking that's Little House on the Prairie farm, the reality of farming on the Great Plains by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, we have things called bonanza farms, which are anywhere from 4,000 to 50,000 acres, and the harvest moves north, and the workers go along with the harvest as it goes along. He didn't like that. He got into mining. He actually worked for a while as a cowboy, comes back to mining, and in 1896 he joins the Western Federation of Miners. There's still a union that only is recruiting miners. He decides that all these workers need to be together in one union without regard to what their job they're doing. Whether you're a farm worker, whether you're a cowboy, you are a worker and you're going to be a member of the industrial workers of the world. So he becomes their director after he organizes it in 1905. He opens the meeting famously by declaring that this meeting is the Continental Congress of the working class. He's also a socialist. I got too much up here, don't need it. He dies in 1928. He dies in Moscow. Later on, you'll see he flees. He's out on bail on a conviction. He goes to Moscow after the Bolsheviks have come to power. He works with them for a while. He dies over there. He is one of 3 Americans whose ashes are in the Kremlin wall where they bury the honormen. So he moves to becoming a communist by later in his life. So, but other founding members, many you would know. There was Mary Harris, known as Mother Jones. Some of you may even know there's a magazine to this day named after Mary Harris Jones. Gene Debs, one of my personal heroes, actually, a labor activist and a member of the American Socialist Party. The IWW, and there are others, I could go down the list, rather prominent names and some not known, very active, people active, because there's a lot of interest at this time in addressing the needs of the working class. Whether you're looking at Jane Addams in Chicago with Hull House, what are we doing? This is not good. These people are barely able to survive on the wages they're paid and the conditions they have to work. So the IWW, I should have known better than this typeface, but I'll read this to you. The preamble said, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Between the two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, not individual unions, but workers as a class, organize, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony with the earth. Abolishing the wage system meant basically getting rid of capitalism. So, moreover, and here's where they get into a dispute with the American Federation of Labor, the trade unions, as they existed, he said, the preamble says, aid the employing class because they mislead the workers into the belief that the working class has interests in common with their employers. They previously said they have no interests in common with the employing class. So instead of the conservative motto of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, we must inscribe on our banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system, or abolition of capitalism. So it is the historic mission of the working class to do away with capitalism. Here they get a little bit closer to Marx. This is the historic role of the working class, of the bourgeoisie, of the proletariat, is to replace the bourgeoisie. But they're not quite Marxists. There are Marxists who will join the IWW, but the IWW itself is not quite Marxist because they say the workers will just take this over by themselves. Most Marxists would argue that the proletariat comes to power, takes control of capitalism by working through the political system. Wobblies want to have nothing to do with the political system. The political system is just part of a facade fooling the workers into thinking they have some real interest. So here's the offices, just for the heck of it. This is what their offices. I should point out to you, at no time in their history did the Wobblies ever number more than about 25,000 dues-paying, card-carrying members. Over the course of the 15 years we're talking about here tonight, they may have had a grand total of about, well, estimates are maybe 250,000 members, in and out. Because these are migrant workers. They're not, you can't go out and collect their dues or find them place to place. It changes. So, but I said they have a dispute with the existing labor unions, most notably the American Federation of Labor, which was led by Samuel Gompers. Now, the AFL was conservative, but they were organized in 1886. They are a federation of trade unions whose members were primarily skilled workers. The people that the Wobblies are looking for are not the skilled workers. They're looking for the unskilled workers. Actually, the AFL wants to have nothing to do with. Now, I should point out that Gompers is not some kind of reactionary. He's conservative politically, but one of the more famous things that Gompers allegedly said, once before a congressional committee, he was asked, well, what is it you union guys want? And Gompers said, more. More money, more time, more or better working conditions, but more. The AFL, unlike the IWW, accepted the capitalist order. They were not revolutionaries. They just want a fairer treatment for workers. They want better social justice. Predominantly, however, not exclusively, but predominantly, they were native-born members, as opposed to all this, as we'll see, huge number of immigrants pouring into the country to help fuel the American economic boom of the late 19th, early 20th century. These guys are mostly native-born. They oppose those immigrants because they tend to believe that those immigrants are actually the cause of their declining overall condition. Well, we were once the masters of labor. We were once the house of labor that controlled our jobs, controlled production. They were the people who initially, in the house of labor, a book that was very commonly read among us graduate students back in the 1970s was The Fall of the House of Labor, written by a man by the name of David Montgomery. Last name ring a bell? Edwin Montgomery is his son. Edward is his son. So anyway, so they want to restrict immigration. The reason why we're losing control of manufacturing, of industry, of the workplace, is because all these immigrants are coming into the country and they're willing to work for cheap wages. Well, the economy would not have boomed without all these immigrants coming in, working in the mines, the mills, working in lumber, working all these jobs that were not particularly, didn't pay well, were dangerous. And of course, they were almost exclusively white. In those places in big cities where they had people who had some of their skills, who had to be a joiner, there would be a separate black AFL local. But the AFL itself was not integrated. So there was one different example that the mine worker, that the IWW might have turned to, and that was the United Mine Workers of America, led by John Mitchell. This was as close as we had to what would later be known as industrial unions. The United Mine Workers of America were primarily centered in the East. They worked in the coal mines, and they took in anybody who worked in the coal mines. They didn't divide them up and say, oh, you're carpenters who are doing this part of work and building these things, therefore you're in a separate union. No, you work in the coal mines or any mines, you're a mine worker. And they had some power and influence because they were handling coal production, specifically handling the mining of anthracite or hard coal. Hard coal, compared to soft or bituminous coal, has much more energy per pound when you burn it, and it's used to heat homes. And many, many homes in the north, northeast were heated by coal. So when there's a strike threatening with the anthracite coal in 1902, this sends concern throughout the American business and political establishment. Teddy Roosevelt calls together people like J. Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, calls together John Mitchell, calls together, as they were known, the coal barons, and says, we got to solve this crisis. You guys got to come to an agreement. It is not, we cannot go into the winter without coal. People are going to freeze in their homes. And John Mitchell and the United Mine Workers knew they had that leverage, and that's what kept them going, made it very difficult to break them down at this point. So, what were labor relations like? Well, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there is no recognized right to organize a union, much less a right to strike. If you were someone who was going around trying to encourage people to join a union and your employer found out about it, you could be fired. Your name could be put on a blacklist. You were a troublemaker, and that blacklist then was circulated through other employers in your area to keep you from getting any kind of a job. So they also hired private detective agencies, security agencies, like the Pinkertons. They're still with us. Burns Security Agency, they're still with us. They would infiltrate the workforce. They would infiltrate attempts to form unions. They would harass the activists. On occasion, they were provocateurs. Maybe we can get the labor people, these unionists, to do something that'll cause trouble, and that'll backfire. One case of that might have been the Haymarket incident in 1886, where someone threw a bomb. There was a big rally for the 8-hour day, 1886 in Chicago. Big rally for the 8-hour day. There's anarchists are speaking, and the police come to break it up. A bomb explodes in the midst of the police. Who threw it? Well, anarchists were there. They must be responsible in some way, shape, or form for it. And 9 of them were convicted of the murder, and several of them will finally be executed. But nobody ever really knows who threw the bomb. Was it a real activist? Or was it a provocateur? Could be. And that's a major example of where we don't know, but it happened in other ones. So, and when there was trouble, the local, the state, the federal authorities always sided with the employers, not the workers. So the workers never looked to the state to say, they'll help us. So that's what labor is like. What does the IWW propose? What is their analysis of society? This is, and I'll read this to you because I know it's small. This is the pyramid of capitalism. They lay out for you exactly how they see society being organized. And I hope I'm not blocking the view over here. But at the very bottom, we have the workers. These are industrial workers on this side. We work for all. Over here, we have agricultural workers. We feed all. Of course, there's a child fallen from weakness. There's somebody waving the red flag of revolution. They're holding up this whole edifice. On the next level are the employing class, who we eat for you. And, well, this is, as the economist Thorsten Veblen said, an age of conspicuous consumption. This is a famous or infamous example of it. You can look at the big mansions that the newly wealthy class was building. Go to Biltmore, which was in one of the Carolinas, which was a private home. Now it's a tourist site and stuff. But so this is a horseback banquet that I'm going to look the man's name up here because I didn't know. I don't remember it right offhand. Cornelius Billings. He has a party for 34 of his friends. He's a horse lover, so he brings in 34 horses to the second floor banquet room of a very prominent then restaurant hotel in New York City. And when they come, they will all eat on horseback. The waiters are all dressed as if they were stable livery people. They're eating there. These are the people, this is just an example of how the wealthy in those days really liked to flaunt their wealth. So, all right, so let's move up the next level. Up here, we shoot at you. These are the agents of the state. Militia, police, when the workers go out on strike or get restless, they can call on the state when we will shoot at you. Examples? Well, just two. The Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. Homestead Steel plant outside of Pittsburgh was one of Andrew Carnegie's plants. He wanted to break one of the few unions that was still strong, the Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers. He also wanted to update equipment in his Homestead plant. Andrew Carnegie liked to present himself to the public as a friend of labor. But he told his plant manager, break the union when you do this. I don't care how. And then he went off to Scotland to spend the summer where the strike is going on. He goes off to a castle he owns in Scotland. So the plant manager tries to call in some strike breakers, some Pinkerton guards. There's literally a pitched battle on the river, the Susquehanna River, where the plant is located, as the workers keep the Pinkertons out. The Pinkertons have to get back on their boats and sail away. But that violence then brings out the state militia, who will then maintain peace and order, but also make sure that the striking workers allow the strike breakers to enter the plant, to break the picket line. Or Pullman, 1894. You can still go to Pullman, Illinois, where George Pullman built the Pullman Palace cars. The Pullman Palace cars were the equivalent of a private aircraft in those days. If you were wealthy, you could either own or rent a Pullman Palace car, and they would hook it onto a train that wants to take you to whatever destination you are next. They also made sleepers. In 1894, both of these happening at the same time because there is a Great Depression going on. If you had asked people in say around 1920, remember the Great Depression? Well, they didn't remember 1929 yet. They remembered the 1890s. So the Pullman said, I've got to cut my workers' wages. But his workers, many of them, lived in housing that he had built for them in Pullman. It was a nice gesture. They were going to have, and you can go there. They were going to have a market. They were going to have a library. They were going to have a theater. And all. He cut their wages. He didn't cut their rents. So the workers go out on strike. There gets support from the American Railway Union. The American Railway Union says, we're not going to move a train that has a Pullman car on it. Oh, what can we do? We will put a mail car on every train that has a Pullman car. And in those days, the United States Post Office was a full-fledged department of the United States government. So if you were stopping a train that had a mail car on it, you were interfering with the operations of the government. And now you could call out troops, to keep the workers back and let the trains move through and break that strike. So when it's set up there that, we will shoot at you, the workers say, hey, yeah, we know what you're talking about. Above them, ministers, bishop, priest, we fool you. Now this isn't quite Marx with opium is the soul of a soulless condition. It is, This is like these priests and ministers are, fooling you. Fooling you how? Oh, don't worry about how bad things are here. Someday, things are going to be wonderful after you die. In fact, Joe Hill wrote a song about this, The Preacher and the Slave. He said, long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right, but ask them, how about something to eat? They'll tell you in voices so sweet, you will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work all day, live on hay, you'll have pie in the sky when you die. There are some who say it was Joe Hill who came up with that saying, pie in the sky. But anyway, so moving up one level, Then we get to the rulers, kings and presidents and the like of the system. But right above them is what it's all about, capital. So this is the pyramid of capitalism that the Wobblies used to recruit their members. They wanted one big union. And this is a picture of a ship bringing in immigrants to New York during one of the periods. Between 1880 and 1914, there is a huge migration of Europeans, mostly from southern Europe, Eastern Europe, areas that had not yet been participating heavily in the Industrial Revolution, and they're moving. Mostly they're coming to the United States, but there will be some going to Argentina, other parts of the world as well. The Wobblies recruited all of these workers, regardless of their skill, their race, their gender, their national origin. You're a worker? We don't care. We don't care if you're a naturalized citizen, anything of the sort. So, and I think there's this big wave of migration coming in. Many Americans are unhappy about this. On the other hand, the employers needed these workers. You know, it's like some of our industries today, meat packing, agricultural workers. We like to say, oh, those people coming across the border, you wouldn't be eating strawberries at the prices you're eating them, for example, without some of those workers. And the same thing is happening then. And I'm jumping ahead of my slides here. So yeah, we needed all those workers. They've got to come in. And the Wobblies are there saying, we're going to organize them because we want to take control of the economic system, of the means of production. So who were these new immigrants? Well, Fred's not here. He did that wonderful talk a couple years ago on the Statue of Liberty. MLS was talking about, give me your tired, your poor, you huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Not all Americans bought that. In fact, these immigrants are coming mostly from southern, eastern, and central Europe. These are areas of Europe where the Industrial Revolution has still not taken the same, has not blossomed the way it has in Northern Europe, Western Europe, or the United States. This is an opportunity to improve their lives. Those who were Mediterranean had darker complexions than earlier immigrants, to the extent that in places, Italians were considered black. Well, the Italians are from southern Italy, from Sicily, very dark-skinned, and in places, at least in the south, some people, they were even treated as if they were black. They weren't Protestants. Up and through the 1880s, the United States was still primarily, heavily, not exclusively, but heavily a Protestant company. But, well, southern Italians, Sicilians, and some Poles, they're Roman Catholic. And at the end of the 19th century, there still is a strong anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. If you came from Greece or from Russia or parts of Eastern Europe, you might have been Eastern Orthodox, even stranger compared to Protestants. And for that, even from the standpoint of some, many of the Ukrainians, Poles, and Russians were Jewish. Anti-Semitism was very strong then. It hasn't really faded away, if you follow the news these days. So these people are not WASPs. They're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In fact, there were people who were worried about it. There was the Great Replacement theory. Well, wait a minute, this is just the early 20th century version of the Great Replacement theory. But people like Madison Grant, who passed himself off as a anthropologist and stuff, he was actually a lawyer, wrote a book, The Passing of the Great Race. All these workers are swamping us upstanding Americans with this inferior group of people coming into the country. Grant felt that the Nordic and Teutonic races were superior, both mentally and physically. Nordic, North, Teutonic, Then you get to the Mediterraneans, and they were physically sturdy, but they didn't have the mental and organizational abilities of Nordics. Well, stop and think about it. The Roman Empire wasn't organized. The Greek Empire. Oh, Grant had an answer. The Nordics did not come in through the Mediterranean and move north. They came around the Black Sea, the Ural Sea. They were actually from the area of Iran today and Persia. They were like, well, an early version of Aryans. And then they came and they helped the Romans get organized. And then there were the peasant races of Eastern and Central Europe. You could tell with them, their physical features were all different. And they were swamping. They were replacing the superior race. The great race was dying out. And you thought Tucker Carlson had a brand new idea of his own. This is 100 years ago. The Wobblies stirred tremendous public reaction. I said this already, probably less than 150,000, maybe as many as 250. No one knows. Never more than 25,000 at any given time. They rallied in huge numbers. They would call their people together when if there was an issue. For example, one of their tactics was free speech fights. How do you reach these people out there who go out on the street corner, you stand in front of the courthouse, and you begin to give a speech? This was typical of the time for a variety of things. That's how the Salvation Army was recruiting its members back in those days, going out and talking. So now you're going out there and you're going to talk industrial unionism. Well, cities fight back. Ban it. You can't have these things. Oh, you've banned free speech? In Spokane, they arrested one person for giving a speech, took him off to jail. While they were gone, another member of the crowd got up and started giving the speech, until 500 of them had been arrested, one after the other. And they did this tactic in a lot of places. They put out the word would get out, and they would show up. The Wobblies themselves were not violent. They were not insurrectionists. They were not trying violently to overthrow the government, but they fought back. If you attacked the Wobblies, they were ready. One example is in Everett, Washington in 1916. The Wobblies are going from Seattle on a boat, 2 boats, up to Everett, not a very great distance, and they're going to go help the lumber workers up there who were on strike. The local police, the posse, had pulled together a posse of 200. The first boat pulls up, the Wobblies want to start getting off. The sheriff said, "I need to talk to your leader." They said, "We don't have leaders. We're all leaders." And then somehow gunfire broke out. And by the end of the little skirmish, 7 people were dead, 5 Wobblies, 2 of the posse. Who fired the first gunshot, no one really knows. But they fought back. Their hostility, their involvement in the strikes, they wanted direct action. Shut this place down. So this did not make them popular with the employing class and their supporters. And this hurts them with their fellow union people. They don't believe in contracts. A contract seems to suggest that the employer has the right to, you've got to be helping the employer as much as the employer is helping you. Well, for some workers in their unions, it's like, well, this contract isn't perfect, but it is a contract that says what I'm going to be paid and what the conditions are for time. I'll take it. And the Wobblies are, we don't want that. We'll settle this grievance right now, and if we got a new grievance in another month, we'll strike again. So, what was, I mentioned this on my, better watch my time here, I can get going. Am I going too long? No. So, what was, they were anarcho-syndicalists. So what was this? Well, anarchism is not anarchy. We think anarchy, wild, loose. No, anarchism simply said, we don't need government. We can rule ourselves. The state is just a tool of the ruling class. Now, this is very idealistic, but that's what they're saying. But they're not saying, oh, let's throw over the government, we'll all do whatever we damn well please. Excuse my language. No, it's not wild. So people would and could and should govern themselves once they had control of the economy. And then syndicalism was this idea that once the workers took over control of the economy, they would organize it for the benefit of the working class. So there was no need to participate in politics, no need for contracts. Workers would just join this one big union. There'd be a general strike. And by a general strike, I don't mean, as did happen on a couple of cities, in that city. It would be all of the workers in America would now be joined into one big union, and they would stage a general strike. That was the tactic they went for. What is, and would it have worked? Because people always ask me this when I talk about, Who knows? I don't find it particularly persuasive. I've read some of their literature, how you went from one state to the other without this sort of like, okay, we'll take over. It seems like in a big economy you need a little bit more of a plan, a little bit more organization. They were involved in several major strikes. Talk about two of them here quickly. The Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912, the Patterson Silk Strike of 1913. By the way, the young woman up here talking to the striking workers is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Joe Hill wrote a song about her, Rebel Girl. So anyway, in Lawrence, and I won't get into the whole thing, the workers go out on strike over lost wages. It becomes famous as the Bread and Roses Strike. The poem was not actually written for this strike. It was earlier, but I'll read it for you up here. As we come marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, give us roses. There is a daycare, was a daycare center down on Lovers Lane, just south of Millen, called the Bread and Roses daycare. I don't know if they, but anyway. The tactic that the Wobblies adopted in Lawrence at their textile strike was, well, the workers are locked out, they're not making any money. Let's see if we can get their children to go to New York or Vermont or someplace else where sympathetic people would support them. This, of course, doesn't look good. Well, we can't feed our kids. We got to send our kids off so they'll be staying for the duration of the strike with other sympathizers. They actually end up winning this strike, but not as much as they would have liked. But it's a pretty impressive tactic that gets them a lot of attention. Or the Patterson Silk Strike, which happens in it's the Patterson Silk Strike. Silk workers go out on strike, and they're not going to be able to win because what's underlying their strike is the employers need to replace the old machinery with modern machinery if they're going to stay in business. And the workers don't want that, but the employers are like, no. But one of the more famous things that comes out of it is the workers actually working with a couple of intellectuals in the old bohemian areas of New York, pulled together the pageant of the Patterson strike. They put it on at Madison Square Garden. They write the texts themselves. They sing any of the songs themselves. They are the performers in all this. One of the more prominent people who works with them on this is a guy by the name of John Reed. John Reed, if you saw the movie Reds, he looked a lot like Warren Beatty in that movie, but Reed wrote one of the first journalistic accounts of the Bolshevik seizure of power called 10 Days That Shook the World. Reed, too, became a communist, and he is the second of the three Americans who are buried in the Kremlin wall. Anyway, off the point there. So what brings the Wobblies down? Factionalism. I've got this tiny script again. Anybody who's ever been involved with any kind of left-wing politics knows that factionalism. No, that's you have to believe this point, precisely this point. The best takeoff on it actually comes from Monty Python's Life of Brian, where the two liberation groups are arguing about, we're the Palestinian Liberation Front. No, we're the Liberation Front of Palestine. It's going to bring down the Wobblies. They like the workers like contracts. I've talked about that. I'll keep moving. The socialists and the Marxists split because they don't believe in anarchism. In the manifesto, Marx criticizes the anarchists of the day, notably Proudhon, the most famous of the French anarchists. The socialist parties want political activism. They want to participate in elections. The Wobblies don't. They don't believe it. You're strengthening the state. The Western Federation of Miners split because the Wobblies will not reject retaliatory violence. AFL, I'm going to just keep moving here because of time, but it's the basic point. Factionalism within the labor movement, within the political movement. The IWW does get suppressed. I've already mentioned the Everett massacre. The other man on the screen here is Frank Little, who was on the executive council of the IWW. He went to Butte to help a copper strike in 1917. Before he had actually said a word, 6 masked people found out which boarding house he was staying in, broke in the door, drug him out, tied him to a car, drug him to a railroad bridge, and lynched him. He became a martyr, of course, to the IWW. But that kind of violence is what the Wobblies encountered. The Bisbee, Arizona deportation of 1917. There was a big strike in the copper mines down in Arizona, employed thousands of workers. The Wobblies were very successful organizing the Mexicans and the Italians, who were the very bottom of the working force there. A couple thousand, they're out on strike. On a Sunday morning, the sheriff calls out a loyalty league of really a group of vigilantes, and first thing in the morning, they go to the homes of the striking workers, bring them all out, force them to march to a baseball field, some 2,000 there. They say, if you'll go back to work at the wages, at the conditions that are being laid down by Phelps Dodge, which was the owner of the mine, you can go back. But if you don't, we're going to load you up onto railroad cars and haul you out of town. And they hauled away well over 1,000 of these workers. Took them first to Columbus, New Mexico, where the sheriff there said, we can't house all them. They took them back in the railroad car. Finally, they let them out in the middle of, the desert, if you will. And then actually the militia, the National Guard, has to come and take them to safe harbor after a couple of days being hauled around. So this is how the government, how the Wobblies faced this. The government also repressed not just the Wobblies, but under World War I, all dissent. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, actually it's all one act, just gets called that twice. Anything that could be construed as hindering the government's fighting for the war. You didn't have to come out and say, we should not be in the, I want Germany to win. I'm opposed to American war aims. You could say something like, Mary Kate, to Kate Richards O'Hare, these wars these days that men fight for, we women have become nothing but brood sows, and we're just turning out young men to die for the war. She got thrown into jail. Gene Debs is arrested, given a 10-year prison sentence for saying, the workers of the world have nothing to gain from this war. Boom. So he goes to jail for 10 years. Actually, it's kind of sad because when the war is over, there's some effort to get commutations or pardons for some of the hundreds of people who went to jail. Woodrow Wilson, being particularly vindictive, specifically refused to commute or pardon Gene Debs. It took Warren Harding a year later to let Debs out. But anyway, and what really breaks them is a trial in Chicago in 1917. Well over 100 IWW leaders and activists go on trial for their activities. 100 people. It took the jury 1 hour to convict them all. There was the American Protective League, which was actually a bunch of vigilantes pulled together who took advantage of the war's effort to say you couldn't dissent against the war, to say anybody who is a labor activist is therefore something we're going to repress. Well, I've said this. Socialists were there. Immigrant radicals who were not naturalized, if you were convicted, could be deported. Well, you can't be naturalized because now you've got a conviction on your record. And by 1921, the USS Buford, called the Red Ark, or the Soviet Ark, hauled 250 of these radicals of various persuasions to Russia, including anarchists. If you know anything about the Bolsheviks and Lenin, he had no use for anarchists whatsoever. And the young man on the right over there who got his career started as a clerk in the Library of Congress, was so impressed with the way the librarians were able to keep track of all their books, came up with a system of keeping track of all these radicals. It was something that he would do for the next 50 years. That's John Hoover, or as we know him, J. Edgar Hoover. So why should we know all this history? Why have I taken an hour or so of your time here to talk about this organization? Well, first of all, it's part of American history, and we should be teaching it. We shouldn't be worrying about, does this make people uncomfortable? Does this make people feel less than happy with their country and their past? That's not, speaking for a couple of the historians in the room that I see, that's not what we're about. We're here to tell the history. And hopefully we're doing a good job of it. We're being objective. We're being fair, or as objective as we can, given our biases and all. But it's not our job to make history something that makes you a more patriotic American. This happened. We should know about it. The term, the epithet, as it became Wobblies, was useful not only to break unions during the war years, but throughout the 1920s, which were lean years for the American labor movement. Even the conservative American Federation of Labor loses 1 million of its 4 million members during this time period. And I also want to point out to you that this criticism of American capitalism and its inequities is not new. The guy on the photograph up there is Robert Owen. 200 years ago this year, Robert Owen gave a 3-hour lecture to the joint Congress, both houses of Congress, talking about, and he was a wealthy industrialist back from Wales, and he saw what was happening in London and the big cities, Manchester over there. So he came up with we've got to come up with a different way of organizing society and life. And he organized the utopian socialist communities. The most famous one, New Harmony, Indiana, right here. Utopian, to distinguish it from what Marx would have called scientific socialism. Marx said, you got to go through these stages, you've got to have these. Utopian said, no, we'll just go on. We're going to have socialism and paradise here on earth. But, so I would just argue it's not un-American to advocate for fundamental economic change. Americans have been arguing for that for 200 years. And people who use, back in the 20s, the epithet Wobblies, it's like the people today who use the term Marxist to describe Joe Biden, and these are people who've probably never read a word of Marx. But if you think that utopian socialist community was just elsewhere, here's Alphadelphia, over in Comstock Township. Today it's River Oak Park. A guy from Ann Arbor by the name of Dr. Schechter persuaded a large number of people to form a big commune, a socialist commune, a utopian socialist commune over the land. It's now River Oaks Park. That building, eventually, after as all these utopian experiments did, it failed. But this building eventually became the Poor Farm for Kalamazoo County. And this is not the original building, but supposedly parts of the original building have been incorporated into this. This is Alphadelphia. So just to let you know, this is there. And then maybe as one final point, we'll look at Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And who knows? Maybe it will rhyme once again. I won't quote from the 18th Brumaire. A couple people know that famous line. Hegel remarks somewhere that history repeats itself. He forgot to add, the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. So that's it. That's it. I hope I was scintillating enough. And I see, and we're taking some questions here. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Any known cross-pollination between the Maguires and the IWW, or were the Maguires too early?
Yeah, Maguires are too early. They're pre-Civil War, if there ever was such an organization. There There were radical mine workers. Some people claim there were Molly Maguires. Some claim there never were. There's no. It's one of these. But no, they exist before the Civil War. So, so Dave's got a question here.
Just a comment. The Alphadelphia Society, which is it was more than it expanded much beyond Comstock. They own tens of thousands of acres in Comstock, Climax, Pavilion Township, and they drew in, I think, a lot of people. There are a lot of people in Kalamazoo but I mean hundreds, if not thousands, whose roots can be traced back to these families that came from, Massachusetts and Upper New York, who came and joined them. And the only reason I know it is because my family, my cousins, owned several hundred acres that were owned and operated by the Alphadelphia Society. And when I was young, I actually went in and I was a ham radio operator, and I took some of their stanchions and put them together and made a tower.
Oh.
But I always knew from the family that they were. They always said that it was he said it was jealousy about people who worked harder than others, and a certain covetous eye towards somebody else's wife.
Yeah,
It brought an end to the communal activities.
yeah. For someone from my generation, it reminds me of all the hippies who went out to the countryside to start these wonderful communes in the 1960s and early 70s, and some of the people worked hard. Everybody's supposed to share everything in common, but some people worked hard, and some just sort of sat around and enjoyed the scenery. And may not have been the case here, but yes, some people worked hard at Alphadelphia and brought in some, and everybody wanted the same share, but not everybody contributed, So, well, Jack, you got.
It's the Alphadelphia Society building that you showed there. Was that the precursor of what was the county poorhouse?
Yes, it was. Yes, that is the county courthouse there.
Poorhouse.
Yeah, and a portion, the poorhouse, the poor farm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the story is that that's not the actual building that they built for Alphadelphia. The real building is incorporated into this much larger building. The county took over this land because in the day before Social Security and other things, the poorhouse, the poor farm is where, well, if you didn't have family and you were poor as you aged, there was no check coming in on the third Wednesday of the month, as some of us got this morning.
Did the Wobblies affect any change, any actual change?
Not directly, no. There's, what they do is that they sort of inspire other, later generations. But there's no law. If there's anything passed with regard to the Wobblies, it's how do we get them down? How do we get rid of them? As opposed to, that's a good idea, we ought to take, but, so.
Well, getting back to Big Bill, he
Yes.
died in Russia in 1928.
Yep.
By 1928, Stalin was in charge, and it was clear, or perhaps clear,
Oh, yeah.
that the dictatorship of the proletariat was a pretty rough totalitarian system.
Yeah.
Is there any word about Bill becoming perhaps disillusioned with what happened there?
Yeah, there is some suspicion that both Bill and John Reed, both sort of when they came to recognize this isn't really what we were thinking, but they were there, and Haywood couldn't come back. Any country he went to would immediately send him back to the U.S. For his prison. And John Reed died young. He died very early. Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist, was on that Red Ark, the Buford, and she was an anarchist. She got over there, and she wouldn't. This has nothing to do with it. She actually ends up back in Canada. She can't get into the United States, but she ends up back in Canada, really homesick, because Emma Goldman came to the United States at the age of 16 with her parents, with her family, and she's here for the next 34 years. this is home. This is her country. This is all she really knows. And she's been kicked out. And she made it clear that she really missed being an American. She was an American. She never gave up anarchism, but she felt that. So you talk about the dreamers today, the people who came here, their parents brought them here, and now they're here, and we want to kick them out because what their parents did. They've lived here 25 years. Some of them are now, physicians. Anyway, others. Brian.
So who was the third person?
I was looking for that, and I could not find the name. I was looking up Kremlin Wall, but I would like to find out just who the other American was. Do some research. Come back for our next meeting if I could find it. So, but yeah, so it's. I mean, a lot of Americans go over in the early years. I mean, people claim that the Ruthers must have been communists because they went and worked in a auto plant in Gorky in the 1930s. They overlook a fact. The reason they were at that auto plant is that it was being set up with the old Ford factory that Henry Ford had donated to the Russians, and the Russians needed help getting this system up and running. Yeah, and two of the Ruthers, not all three, but two of the Ruthers were over there. So yeah, they go, but yeah, people get this, but that also, I mean, that leads to another split in the American left, as those socialists who will, become communists, and those who are like, no way, So, and it weakens the American left for a decade or two. So. Thank you. What did he do? I recognize, that's, okay. Charles Ruthenberg. Yeah, I remember the name as soon as you said it, Ruthenberg, but I couldn't remember what he did. Yeah. Yeah. Well, keep in mind it was a young librarian who went on to lead the Federal Bureau of Investigations and keep. Yeah. So, all right. I hope it's so. Yeah, and don't forget to take your little booklet along.